She fell to her knees in tears on center court, not from pain, from history. This is the moment a 21-year-old from the Philippines beat a champion who had never lost this early at Wimbledon, and in doing so, changed what an entire country believed was possible. For a few seconds she couldn't even speak. The crowd was on its feet. Flags were waving, and on the other side of the net stood a six-time Grand Slam champion, the defending Wimbledon title holder, watching her reign end in real time. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. Not on center court. Not in the third round. And yet here it was, unfolding in front of millions. To understand why this moment hit so hard, you need to understand where this young woman came from, and just how far she had to travel to get here. Alex Eala was raised in a country where tennis has almost no history of producing world-class champions. Basketball owns the Philippine sporting imagination. Boxing has its legends. Tennis, for decades, was something Filipino fans watched happen to other countries. A sport with no real pathway, no real infrastructure, no real precedent for a homegrown player breaking into the elite tiers of the game. She grew up training with her family close by, learning the fundamentals in modest conditions long before academies or sponsorships entered the picture. Later, she moved through a respected training system in Spain, grinding through the junior and lower professional circuits with a game built on patience, footwork, and tactical intelligence, rather than overwhelming power. It was a career built quietly, slowly, without the noise that usually surrounds a rising star. But quiet doesn't mean small, and this season the quiet finally broke open. Before this year's Wimbledon, Eala's record in Grand Slam main draws told a difficult story. Just 1 win against 5 losses. That's the kind of stat that follows a player around, whispered by commentators, used as evidence that maybe she wasn't quite ready for the biggest stages yet. She had flashes of brilliance, sure. A stunning win over Iga Swiatek during her breakthrough run to the Miami Open semi-final the year before had put her name on the map. But Swiatek answered a month later in Madrid, and for a while, that result felt like the final word on the rivalry, an interesting footnote rather than a real threat. Heading into this year's grass court season, though, something had clicked. She won the Birmingham Open, her second WTA 125 title. She reached the semi-finals of the WTA 500 tournament in Berlin. Her form on grass specifically had become dangerous, the surface rewarding her instincts at the net and her ability to shorten points before rallies dragged on too long. For the first time in her career, she arrived at Wimbledon seeded, the 29th seed, the very first Filipina in the tournament's history to hold that distinction. She opened her campaign by dismantling Mexico's Renata Zarazua in straight sets, 6-1, 6-2 in barely over an hour. Confident, efficient, a statement that the seeding wasn't a fluke. Her second-round test carried more emotional weight than most people realized. Waiting for her was Australia's Maya Joint, fresh off a headline-grabbing win of her own. But Joint was also the player who had beaten Eala in a brutal Eastbourne final just a year earlier, a loss Eala later admitted hit her so hard she couldn't watch the highlights for months afterward. That kind of defeat doesn't just disappear, it waits quietly for the next time the two players meet, and for one set, it looked like the ghost might win again. Joint broke early, dictated the rallies, and closed out the opening set in decisive fashion. But instead of unraveling, Eala adjusted, attacking the net more aggressively, tightening her own errors, riding a wave of support from a crowd packed with Filipino flags. She won the second set comfortably, then delivered a stunning bagel in the third, 6-love, erasing the memory of Eastbourne in under 2 hours. It wasn't just a win, it was closure. That victory alone made her the first Filipina in history to reach the third round of a Grand Slam. And it set up the match nobody had circled on their calendar as remotely close, but which would become the defining moment of her career. Iga Swiatek walked into that third-round match as the defending champion, a 6-time major winner, someone who had never in her career suffered a loss this early at Wimbledon. She'd cruised through her first 2 rounds without much resistance, most recently dismissing a former finalist in straight sets. On paper, this matchup shouldn't have been competitive. A 29th seed against a 6-time Grand Slam champion defending her home turf essentially, on the sport's most prestigious grass, but paper doesn't play tennis. And this rivalry, small as it was in sample size, had already shown it produces something unpredictable whenever these two share a court. The opening set became an instant classic, the kind of tennis that silences a crowd not through blowout dominance, but through sheer tension. Swiatek struck first, breaking for an early lead with a forehand pass on the line. Eala answered immediately, breaking straight back with a daring high moonball return followed by a sharply angled pass. The set swung back and forth, players trading momentum like a tide that refused to settle. Eala built a lead, holding a set point at 5-3. Swiatek, defending champion instincts kicking in, ripped off three consecutive forehand winners to save it and level the set. Neither player could pull away after that. It went to a tiebreak. What followed was almost unbearable to watch if you cared about either player. Eala raced out to a 5-2 lead in the breaker. Swiatek clawed back with a 4-point surge to reach set point of her own. Eala saved it, saved another, and another. 4 breakpoints fended off in total across the set, until finally, on her third set point of the tiebreak, a mishit forehand from Swiatek sailed long, and the opening set, 84 minutes of it, belonged to Eala. The second set told a different story entirely. Eala, riding the emotional high of surviving that marathon opener, seized control almost immediately, racing out to a 4-love lead built on relentless returning, sharp defense, and clutch serving under pressure. Swiatek briefly stopped the bleeding, clawing back 2 games, but it wasn't enough. Eala closed out the match 6-2, sealing it with a forehand winner that sent center court into an eruption of noise rarely heard for a 29th seed, 2 hours and 14 minutes. That's how long it took to end a champion's title defense. What happened next is the part that turned a great result into an unforgettable moment. Eala dropped to her knees, overcome, tears streaming as the crowd rose around her. In her on-court interview, still catching her breath, she admitted she was overwhelmed with emotion. She spoke about how achievements like this might look small to someone like Swiatek, who has won so many majors, or to legends like Serena or Venus Williams. But for someone who grew up in the Philippines, training after school with her brother and grandfather, wearing ruffled socks and carrying a childhood dream that never had a clear pathway, this meant everything. She couldn't even finish the sentence before the emotion took over completely. Later, in her press conference, she reflected on the mental discipline it took to survive that marathon first set, describing how she forced herself to take everything 1 point at a time, rather than let the scoreboard pressure creep in. She talked about instinct taking over once she saw her opportunities, about not overthinking the moment and simply trusting her hands when the ball arrived. And she spoke directly to the people who mattered most, her family, her fans back home, and every young Filipino girl who might now believe, for the first time, that this sport has room for them too. For Swiatek, the aftermath was heavier. The defeat didn't just end her Wimbledon title defense. It dropped significant ranking points and threatened to push her out of the world's top 10. A symbolic collapse for a player who has spent years among the sport's most dominant figures. In the days following, she spoke candidly about no longer focusing on results, admitting instead that she needs to rebuild parts of her game during what has become a genuinely difficult season for her. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from someone usually defined by relentless consistency. For Eala, the numbers alone tell a remarkable story. She improved to 2 wins and 1 loss in her head-to-head against Swiatek. She pushed her record against top 10 opponents to 7 wins and 4 losses, remaining undefeated on grass this season. And most importantly, she became the first player from the Philippines in history to reach the second week of a Grand Slam tournament, a milestone that, for a nation with almost no tennis pedigree, feels less like a sports headline and more like a cultural turning point. Consider what that actually means. Somewhere in Manila, in Cebu, in small towns without proper tennis courts, there are children who just watched someone who looks like them, who grew up like them, walk onto the most famous court in the world and beat a legend. That kind of image doesn't fade quickly. It plants itself in the imagination of a generation. It tells them the door isn't just open a crack anymore. It's been kicked wide open. Her reward for all of this? No time to rest. Waiting in the round of 16 is Jasmine Paulini, the 13th seed, and a former Grand Slam finalist in her own right, fresh off a dominant win of her own. It's another enormous test, another opponent with major experience Eala still doesn't have at this depth of a tournament. But after what just happened on center court, doubting her has become a much riskier bet than it used to be. Because here's the truth underneath all of this. Before this tournament, Eala was a promising player still searching for the signature win that would validate everything people suspected she was capable of. Now she has it, not against an easy target, not in a lesser event, but against a defending Wimbledon champion on center court, in front of the entire tennis world. This wasn't a lucky break or a favorable draw. It was 84 excruciating minutes in 1 set alone, 4 breakpoints saved under maximum pressure, and a mental toughness that revealed itself exactly when it mattered most. Swiatek will regroup. Champions usually do. But for Eala, this moment cannot be undone. No matter what happens next in this tournament or any other, she has already rewritten the ceiling for what a Filipino tennis player can achieve. And she did it not by sneaking through a weakened draw, but by looking a legend in the eyes and refusing to blink. The scoreboard said 7-6-6-2, but the real story was written in those tears on center court, the sound of an entire nation's disbelief turning, point by point, into belief. And whatever comes next in this tournament, one thing is already permanent. Eala didn't just win a tennis match. She proved, in front of the whole world, that the impossible was only ever a matter of time.